Welcome to the Sounds of Resistance channel. With the progress of the Ukrainian heroes at full speed, the Russian army came to the point of disintegration. The collapse period in the Russian army, which leader Vladimir Putin could not prevent, started to move important foundation stones in the Ukraine war. With the soldiers in the Russian army leaving the Ukrainian fronts day by day, the vacuum in the army was tried to be filled with the mobilization announced throughout Russia. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin ignited the fuse that would cause Russian citizens to flee the country with the mobilization decision he announced throughout the country. Because Russian citizens started to leave Russia's borders because they did not want to fight in vain and die in Ukraine. With the gathering of 300,000 volunteer soldiers, which Vladimir Putin wanted to include in the Russian army, the departures from Russia began to increase. Moscow local media reported that as many as 700,000 civilians have fled Russia since Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization announcement last month. This announcement figure is horrendously large and represents only 1 month's rate. In a televised speech on September 21st, the chaos that began the moment Vladimir Putin announced that Russia had declared a partial mobilization of 300,000 troops for the first time since World War II continued to spread rapidly. Since the announcement, the Russians have fled desperately to the border of neighboring countries to escape. This situation caught the attention of Russian expatriates and those who wanted to help. A few hours after Russian leader Vladimir Putin's announcement, flight prices for airlines in Russia rose significantly. The prices of plane tickets from Russia to Turkey and Georgia reached gigantic figures such as $4,000 to $5,000. Images and videos on social media have showcased activity on Russian borders, including aerial footage of long queues on the Georgian border. All of these developments attracted a lot of attention of one person. Ira Lobanovskaya, who fled the country before the invasion, founded the online project The Free World Guide to help other Russians relocate while watching the unfolding chaos. This project, which shook the world agenda, became a light of salvation for thousands of Russian citizens. Ms. Lobanovskaya was born in the North Caucasus region and also lived for many years in Moscow. After the mobilization plan was announced, she managed to get all the attention by designing a website while researching how to get the Russians out of their country. Millions of Russian citizens participated in this huge project designed by Ms. Lobanovskaya in record numbers. Just 1 day after the Russian leader's mobilization announcement, nearly 1.5 million Russian citizens accessed the online project Guide to the Free World. Ms. Lobanovskaya estimates that as many as 70,000 Russians using the group's services have already left or are planning to leave Russia. Much more flight from Russia is expected in the coming weeks and months. The fact that Russian citizens who fled during the mobilization decision bought a one-way ticket shows that they will not return to Russia again. The UK Ministry of Defense said the exact number of people fleeing Russia is uncertain, but the number of people leaving Russia likely exceeded the size of the total occupation force deployed in Ukraine in February, when the Moscow administration first invaded the country. In addition, the UK Ministry of Defense stated that the mass exodus of Russians who wanted to escape the call caused a significant brain drain in the country, because the majority of Russian citizens who left were young and educated people. With reserves mobilized in Russia, the local economic impact of the dwindling workforce availability and the acceleration of the brain drain are likely to become increasingly important. The Russian leader has signaled a general mobilization decision, which envisages that an estimated 20 million Russians will be recruited to fight. With this shocking statement of Vladimir Putin, increased direct flights in Russia reached record levels and saw 27% hike rates. But citizens who left Russia faced many difficulties while escaping from mobilization. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland have recently decided to turn away Russian tourists at the border, while the EU has already banned direct flights between 27 member states and Russia. For this reason, Russian citizens whose options have decreased have started to prefer countries that do not require a visa. And sometimes some Russian citizens gave up their escape with the decision of mobilization and returned to Russia. Reports from border crossings with Georgia, Finland, and other countries shared data suggesting that Russian authorities had given up on fleeing and enlisted some men of military age at the scene. However, the number of Russian citizens who fled the mobilization decision and later gave up on this decision is quite low. In general, Russian citizens don't want to fight in Ukraine and are doing their best to save their lives. The dictator leader Vladimir Putin, who skillfully uses the 7th article, which is the secret article of the mobilization decision, can change the number of soldiers he will mobilize to the Russian army at any time. This situation makes Russian citizens very uneasy. If you notice the first days of the mobilization decision, the number of soldiers to be recruited into the Russian army was only around 300,000. But over time, both the statements of Russian leader Putin and Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and Putin's puppet, were giving the signals that these figures would change. Now the two began to talk about the dire numbers of the number of volunteers to be recruited into the Russian army. The Russian leader's latest figure is 20 million. Although it seems impossible for the number of volunteers to be recruited to the Russian army to reach 20 million, this situation causes serious anxiety in Russia and reveals the helplessness of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The U.S. Department of Defense estimates that as many as 100,000 Russian soldiers may have been killed or injured since the Kremlin invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Since this figure announced by the U.S. includes elite Russian soldiers and officers, Vladimir Putin wants to increase the number of volunteers to be mobilized into the Russian army so much, because the Russian army is very costly to train. Thousands of fighter pilots, dozens of Russian senior generals, and armored vehicle personnel were lost in the Ukraine war. In addition, the Russian army lost thousands of tanks and armored war vehicles in this invasion operation. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is trying to cover this loss as much as he can. But there is a situation in Russia that even authoritarian leader Putin is almost unaware of this situation. Volunteer citizens mobilized in Russia and sent to war in Ukraine, including minority republics of the Russian Federation, are often at the forefront of the Ukrainian war. And so, during the conflict, the first to be injured or killed are these volunteer citizens. In other words, the Russian leader is causing bigger wounds in the Russian army instead of eliminating the casualties he intended. The Kremlin administration and Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who failed to make gains on the battlefield, do not give up on seeking the remedy from time to time in the policies of threats and blackmail, especially threatening the U.S. administration and Western countries to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Putin has repeatedly stated that this decision was not a bluff. However, according to the administrations of many world states, this nuclear threat of the Russian leader is seen as a huge risk, as it will put NATO in a difficult situation. But the harsh stance of the U.S. and NATO administration against Putin's nuclear threat leaves only a small possibility for Russia to use nuclear weapons, because Russian leader Putin does not want to clash too much with NATO and the U.S. administration. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to be notified of new videos. Thank you for watching us.